Good evening, everybody who's joined us and are joining us. And thank you for joining us for a conversation between Dawoud Bey and Leigh Raiford. This talk is part of a series of initiatives in tribute to Frieze's Vision and Justice project and its founder, my friend Sarah Elizabeth Lewis, who's an associate professor at Harvard University. The Vision and Justice Project, which Sarah founded, is dedicated to examining art's central role in understanding the relationship between race and citizenship in the United States. Dawoud Bey is recognized for his rich, psychologically compelling images. In his work, Dawoud explores a range of formal and material methodologies to create images and projects that connect deeply with the communities he photographs. His major exhibition, An American Project, currently on view at the Whitney Museum of Art, highlights his 4-decade commitment to portraying the Black subject and African-American culture. Leigh Raiford is Associate Professor of African-American Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, where her scholarship centers on issues of race, gender, justice, and visuality. Leigh wrote about Dawoud's Birmingham Project for the 2016 Vision and Justice issue of Aperture Magazine. Works from this series are currently on view in Grief and Grievance, Art and Mourning in America at the New Museum, as well as in the Whitney Museum. Leigh will be co-editing the new Vision and Justice imprint with Sarah and Deb Willis. Two smarter people I have never had the pleasure of getting into a single virtual room in my past, so I'm looking forward to this conversation. The conversation will expand upon Bey and Raiford's ongoing dialogue on the representation of Blackness as an aesthetic and political act, and the role that photography plays in visualizing history. Please join me in welcoming Dawoud and Leigh for what I'm sure will be an absolutely fascinating dialogue. And I will leave it, I'm going to pass it over to you, Leigh and Dawoud, and very much look forward to listening in and seeing what you have to say. I'm sure it's going to be absolutely wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for doing this.
Okay, thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Sean. Well, I'll start. It's always great to see you, Dawoud, and be in conversation with you. Thank you, and I want to thank Sean Kelly and the folks at Sean Kelly Gallery, Adair and Lauren, and I also would like to thank Falake Olugunja, works with Dawoud for helping doing all the sort of invisible labor to get us here. I also want to thank Frieze and congratulate Frieze for embracing the Vision and Justice project as the kind of roadmap, a roadmap for social change. That is certainly one of Sarah's intentions. The project as a whole, and I think of the celebration of Vision and Justice and of Sarah Lewis. For Sarah's capacity to gather. I always think of her as somebody who really has a gift for bringing so many people with her into the room and gathering us. And it was Sarah who introduced Dawoud and I through her invitation to me to write about the Birmingham Project for Vision and Justice, that for the Aperture issue. I don't know if we have that first slide that we might share with everyone. And I had long admired Dawoud's work, but we didn't know each other personally. And it was just and it sort of Sarah's kind of vision to pair us has really been just an ongoing gift. And I am, Dawoud, you're just one of my most favorite interlocutors, artists and thinkers. So I'm so grateful for Sarah in that way. And then I'm also grateful for the Vision and Justice project as a whole, which in its really incisive phrasing of vision and justice, Sarah has offered us a language that understands the long history around representation, around Black representation as an intertwined political and cultural category. And in doing so, She gathers a long history of artists, of activists, of thinkers, of everyday folk, and whichever or how many of those categories any of us operate at any given time, right? She gathers us into that history, that struggle, and that endeavor for justice. Thinking about wrestling with these issues, the struggle for belonging, and how do we seeking to kind of express a truer word about blackness, about Black life. And I think one of the things that Vision and Justice also does so enormously well is that it keeps the experience or the reality, the fact of anti-Black violence at its center, the anti-Black violence that really undergirds this country's history, and that question of violence, of anti-Black violence, has often has haunts the question of Black visuality, um, broadly. And I think, Dawoud, we often don't think of your work as engaging with anti-Black violence, and yet it seems very much at the core of your work, or at least to kind of it animates it in ways that are seen and unseen, and so I think this would be a good place um, for you to maybe, if you could talk to us a little bit about the Birmingham Project specifically.
Okay, well, thank you, Lee. And before I do that, I, of course, just want to echo everything that you have said in gratitude to Sarah Lewis for initiating this project and this particular issue of Aperture that brought us together, and as I would like to say, allowed us to continue to build community, which is what I think is the thing that allows our work to continue to move forward and out into the world. And certainly, Frieze embracing this suggests that this is a conversation that needs to be more broadly had, and that it's a conversation that should, in fact, at this moment and even preceding moments, uh, have a wider participation in terms of who engages in the conversation, and certainly makes apparent the necessity for the intersection of the art community to have some kind of relationship to this issue of social justice. So I'm glad that we could be here on this occasion and in this place, even though virtually, because when people think about the art world proper, they don't necessarily think about these conversations. And I think that they certainly do need to begin to think about these conversations taking place in a wide range of forums. So having said that, if we can go to the first slide. Thank you. And this is in fact where the Birmingham Project begins. The Birmingham Project begins with this publication, The Movement, documentary of a struggle for equality that was published in 1964 as a fundraising vehicle for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It was a book of photographs of and about the civil rights movement. I came to the book because my mother and father had gone to hear James Baldwin speak at the church that I grew up in. And after Baldwin's lecture, the movement was being sold at the reception after his talk. His talk may well have been arranged in conjunction with the book. It may have been sort of a book tour. I don't know. But Baldwin figures in this narrative too, because it was because my parents went to hear James Baldwin speak that they came to buy the book and to bring the book home and to make the book available to me. And in looking through the book, which I don't recall doing immediately after my parents brought it home, they kind of just left it laying around so that I could find my way to it, I suppose. And in looking at the photographs, there were 3 photographs. If we go to the next slide, that I distinctly remember in a very visceral way. There were a lot of really violent photographs in this book. There was documentation of the movement, and there was also documentation of the violence done to Black bodies that led to the movement. And this photograph of these police in Clarksdale, Mississippi, that Danny Lyon took, it just kind of shook me to the core because I realized I never wanted to encounter these police officers. Who and what they were was very much apparent to me, even at that young age. I was 11 years old when my parents brought this book home. So this is one of the photographs that kind of jolted my consciousness when I saw it. The other, go to the next slide, thank you, was this lynching photograph. And it's a photograph of the lynching of Will Brown at the Omaha courthouse in 1919. And if you know your history and have done some research, you know that 1919 was a particularly violent flashpoint moment in the history of violence against African Americans in this country. And upwards of 20,000 people witnessed the lynching of Will Brown, the very, very public lynching of Will Brown at the Omaha courthouse in 1919. And then finally, this third photograph, which is a photograph of Sarah Jean Collins in the aftermath of the dynamiting of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama on September 15, 1963. This photograph in particular seared itself into my consciousness. Even more deeply interestingly than the other two. And the lynching photograph is clearly more violent. I mean, clearly, by extreme degrees, but this photograph, this haunting photograph of this young Black girl that I hadn't entirely intuited at the moment that I was looking at the photograph, that she was very much the same age that I was as I was looking at the picture. And that may well have been what caused me to have such a visceral response to this particular photograph. Sarah Jean Collins is the younger sister of Addie Mae Collins, who was one of the 4 girls killed in the dynamiting of the 16th Street Baptist Church that Sunday morning. She was also in the girls' room with the other 3 girls, but she was further away from the point of the blast that she wasn't killed. She was on the opposite side of the room. Her sister and the other 2 girls were on the side of the room on which had been placed on the other side of the wall, the dynamite. So they got the full effect of the blast. But she was seriously wounded, lost one eye and partial vision in the other. And so this photograph, which I saw in the book when I was 11 years old, and I just kind of pushed it somewhere to the side in my psyche. But 40 some odd years later, it came back in a rush one morning, completely unexpectedly. And I told myself that I needed to respond to this. I needed to go to Birmingham, Alabama, and I needed to figure out through my work how I might respond both to this photograph and how I might respond to that particularly violent historical moment. And so that's what I did. I didn't know anyone in Birmingham, Alabama. I'd never been to Birmingham, Alabama before, but I went to Birmingham for an extended weekend to bear witness to the site where this incident had occurred and to begin to take in the place where this had happened in preparation for whatever I might go on to do. If we go to the next slide. These are the other girls who were killed in the dynamiting of the church. The youngest was Denise McNair. She was 11 years old. And Carol Robertson, Addie Mae Collins, and Cynthia Wesley were 14 years old. Go to the next slide, thank you. And so I scheduled a trip to Birmingham, most immediately to visit 16th Street Baptist Church. And not just to visit, but to visit and attend a service at 16th Street Baptist Church. So I made plans to be there through a weekend and attended a service at the church on Sunday and had a very brief conversation with the minister who was at the back door after service, greeting people as they left. And my brief conversation with the minister, which I won't go into great detail now, but it gave me a sense of the real complexity of that history. And the fact that I was looking to respond to history in the present moment. Because when I told the minister that I was a photographer and artist from Chicago, and that I was planning on coming back to make work in Birmingham, and he asked me, well, what would you like to make work about? And I told him, to me, I thought I had probably a strange notion that it would have been self-apparent what I wanted to make work about, which it clearly wasn't. He asked me, what do you want to make work about? And I said, I'm interested in looking back at that moment, September 15th, 1963. And he kind of stopped me before I could go any further. And he said, well, let me stop you right there, because here at 16th Street Baptist Church, we're not about all that business. Which jolted me. And I kept a straight face, hopefully, but it jolted me. And he said, we're about the business of Jesus Christ. And if you would like to make some work about that, we would love to work with you. And at that point, I left realizing that I'm here trying to grapple with something that happened 40 some odd years ago. As this minister is in the present moment trying to grapple with the issue of ministering to his congregation. That was the first time that the past and the contemporary moment kind of collided. and I realized the complexity of what I was attempting to do. Go to the next slide, thank you. And so I just started spending time in Birmingham, taking in the place, familiarizing myself with the place, making these quick sketch photographs, three of which are made in the Smithfield community that three of the girls lived in. I wanted to know the place that they had come from, and I wanted to know the place. I didn't feel that I could or that I had the right to just go there and attempt to make work based on what I thought I knew, which had been already thrown into some kind of stark contradictory relief by the minister. Next slide, thank you. I sought and found the grave site of the youngest girl, Denise McNair, and went there and paid tribute to her memory. Next slide, please. And then began to meet people in the community. When I firmly decided that I was going to make work there, I started reaching out into the community, and I initially reached out to the Birmingham Museum of Art, because my history of working with the museum to realize my project by this time had a very long history, in fact. And it was the museum that introduced me to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, which is where I spent time doing research, both in the Birmingham Civil Rights Archive, and also, if you go to the next slide, in the archive of Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, who was a very activist minister in Birmingham, who was at the center of the movement in Birmingham. And his archives contained everything from his sermon notes to documentation of his house and his church and the parsonage when it had been dynamited, because the dynamiting of 16th Street Baptist Church is not the first time that a church had been dynamited, or the parsonage of a church had been dynamited in Birmingham. Birmingham was so conspicuously dynamited by the Klan and white racists that it was actually known as Birmingham. That's how frequently Black people's homes and properties were being dynamited. They were living literally in a state of white racist terror. Go to the next slide. It was through the research at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute that I first found out that the history of that day, September 15th, 1963, was not just the history of the four girls being killed in the dynamiting of the church, but also two African-American boys who were killed in the violent aftermath of the dynamiting of the church in two separate yet entirely related racist incidents. One of them, Johnny Robinson, 16 years old. The streets of Birmingham after the dynamiting were full of both white racist citizens celebrating and waving Confederate flags, and Black folks who were out in the street in a state of agitation over what had happened that morning. And police said that they saw 16-year-old Johnny Robinson throwing rocks at one of the cars from which some white racists were whooping it up and flying the Confederate flag. And they called out to him, and he turned around and walked away. And the police officer shot him in the back, killed him in the street right there. in downtown Birmingham. And Virgil Ware and his brother had just finished delivering their Sunday newspapers some ways outside of downtown Birmingham. And two white teenagers who were coming from a rally that had been held by the Klan and the White Citizens Council after the dynamiting of the church. Virgil Ware and his brother encountered two white teenagers, one of them whom took out a pistol and shot Virgil Ware off of the bike. Him and his brother was sharing a bike on their way to their uncle's junkyard, actually, to see if they could salvage some pieces from the junkyard to build a second bike. So it was these two brothers riding on one bike, and one of these white teenagers just lifted his pistol out of his waistband and shot him dead. So once I knew about these two African-American boys who had also been killed, that it was 6 young Black people and not 4, I knew that I also had to embrace these two young African-American boys in the shape of whatever the work was going to be. And this began a series of periodic visits to Birmingham over 7 or 8 years. I can't remember, but I spent a lot of time visiting Birmingham. I was in the midst of other work, but periodically I would return to Birmingham, continue my research at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, continue my relationship building in the community, building a community in Birmingham, hanging out in barbershop, greasy spoon restaurant, sticking my head in beauty parlors, but just letting people know that I was there and that I was going to be coming back and letting them know who I was before I attempted to do any work, because I felt like I needed to have, at the very least, the implicit support of the community, because I was going to be making work that was work about their history and was at some point, once the museum agreed to be a partner in this work, was going to be exhibited in their community. So I wanted to do my own relationship building. So that was a process of 7, 8 years of just going back and forth. So by the time I decided, you know, what kind of shape I was going to give the work, I had a kind of encyclopedic sense of Birmingham's history. I had met and spent time speaking with Taylor Branch, who I hope you know, and if you don't, you should be familiar with Taylor Branch, who wrote an epic trilogy of books on the South and the Civil Rights Movement, and who is a scholar and historian who is unusually well versed in the history of the moment that I wanted to make work about. So go to the next slide, please. And so I decided to, after speaking with the museum and speaking with the minister at Bethel Baptist Church, which had been Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth's home church, that I wanted to make these two sites, the Black communal space of the church and the once segregated space of the Birmingham Museum, which during that time, like all public institutions in the South, was a segregated institution. I wanted to use both of those spaces with their attendant history as the site that I would begin to make these portraits. And I started initially with the idea of wanting to give the mythic, or in the case of the two boys, unknown presences of these 6 young African Americans a more palpable presence by making portraits of young African Americans in Birmingham now who are the exact same ages that these 6 young people were, to give them a more tangible, more palpable presence, which still left the work feeling incomplete, because I also wanted to address the issue of multiple issues, actually, the passage of time, and the passage of time in relation to those 6 abbreviated young Black lives, to try to figure out a way conceptually and visually to embody this idea of what those 6 young African Americans had never been allowed to grow into or become. And so I decided to also make portraits of African Americans in Birmingham who were the ages that those 6 young people would have been had they not been violently killed. And if you think about history in reverse, those older African Americans were in fact the same ages as those young people. And some of them actually knew one or more of those young people. So they were the embodiment of that history. And then to make them in separate locations and to photograph them separately, but then to bring them together in the diptych format, so that each piece embodied 50 years. A young person who was 11 and an older African American who was 61 or 63 and 13. To figure out a way to make the past and the present resonate in a single photographic object. Because how does one photograph the past? Or how does one do more than go to 16th Street Baptist Church and make a photograph of it, the place where it happened? I wanted the work to function in a more conceptually rich and resonant way, to make that history more viscerally felt in a way that also, if you think about it, embodied a kind of contemporary engagement with the present African American community in Birmingham, because everyone that I was photographing did in fact live in Birmingham. They were Black citizens of a place that had this history. And interestingly enough, as I was visiting schools and having conversations with the young people, every young person that I talked to, knew this history. So this history is something that is in the soil and in the air of this community. It has not been forgotten. We'll go to the next slide. So this is how I began to bring the past and the present together. Looking at each individual portrait, or how they each spoke to each other, putting them together in a way that suggested either a relationship, gesture, temperament, psychology, something that would make them hold together as a single piece. Go to the next one. Both in the museum itself, photographing in the 17th century room and 18th century room of the Birmingham Museum of Art, and in Bethel Baptist Church. Bethel Baptist Church, of course, completely in the spirit of Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, completely embraced this project. It gave me complete access to the church, and that they were really supportive. Next slide, please. I won't go into the complex history, but I'll just say, unlike 15th Street Baptist Church, there's a very complex history there that Taylor Branch actually writes about in his first book in that trilogy called Parting the Waters. Uh, History is a very messy thing. And I think we forget that because what we receive is usually a tidied up version of what is actually a very messy and somewhat contradictory history. And then I think I have one more. And in some cases, the bringing together of the young person and the older person proves to be really uncanny because sometimes they look like they could have been members of the same family. And some of the people that I photographed separately actually did know other people in the photograph because they were all pretty much a part of, the same community. And then finally, next slide. This is the first installation of the Birmingham Project in the Birmingham Museum, almost exactly 50 years to the day of the bombing of the church. The exhibition opened September 2013. This, there are multiple layers to the work, but if you think about the Birmingham Museum, a once segregated public institution uh, in a city where the adults in the photograph at one time could not even legally enter, and for them to now be occupying space on the wall of that very institution is also a part of the of my conception of the project. So I think I'll stop there, but that's meant to give, I think, some background to the work because the work does not just spring from the imagination. It's actually in conversation, literally with history, and also it's in conversation with other photographs embedded in that history and trying to devise a way to speak back to those photographs, some of which are images of extreme violence being enacted on Black bodies. And how does one take that and transform it into something in which the Black body and the Black subject now have a certain degree of agency and a certain degree of affirmative presence in the contemporary moment? How does one speak back to images by making a new set of images and creating a new counter narrative and a counter history to the history of those photographs?
I just thank you for that, Dawoud. I mean, it's just so it's so rich everything you've said, and to hear the process, and I'm struck by so many things, and even that you've developed a series, you created a series that is both manages to commemorate the dead and acknowledge that history of the Birmingham bombing. But it also manages to honor the present and make space for survival and this longer history. And I'm sort of struck by the first images from the movement that you started with, and sort of thinking about how both the being jarred both by the photograph of the lynching of Will Brown, but also of the survival of Sarah Jean Collins.
Mhm.
And I think we think so much, obviously, we're especially even in our contemporary moment, we are so focused. We think about the loss of life, but also what it means to survive violence, right?
Mhm.
And I think what the Birmingham Project also gives us, and I think what makes it so powerful is that that the trauma and that violence that Black folks have experienced is, um, neither individual, right? It's never ours alone, and we carry it with us in ways that can't be seen, right? It's not always marked so visibly, and I think that your photographs and the Birmingham Project um, actually give us that, right? They
Yeah,
sort of.
it commemorates, it kind of simultaneously commemorates and affirms, or
Mhm.
commemorates and reaffirms, or commemorates and reasserts, the living, breathing, complex
Right,
Black personhood that was Will Brown, being Leigh.
right.
That Will Brown was a human being with a rich sense of interiority, a
Hmm.
rich sense of life in his living, which is the thing that, I always want my work to do, is to move from being a photograph, standing looking at a photograph, which they're made fairly well. I'm aware of that because I know how to do that. But I wanted to move from that to being a more resonant experience of the individual in the photograph. I
Hmm.
wanted to move from object to experience. And for me, that's when the work starts to do the deeper work that I think it needs to do, when it becomes experience. Yes, it is an object, it's a photographic object, and it's a photographic object of a particular kind. But what I want people to have more than anything else uh, is an experience of the individual in
Hmm.
those photographs. So, yeah, they both commemorate and affirm,
Hmm.
and they reach forward and backward at the same time, into the past and into the present.
And I think even for me, it's a kind of, it is both that kind of Sankofa bird, right? Of like having your feet firmly planted in the present and being able to look backwards and gather what we need, and feeling drawn in to a community, even as we're looking at individuals. And I'm also struck by how, um, you know, trying to imagine what a project might have looked like had you just gone, and made those photographs on that. The pastor had said, "Sure, go ahead, make the photographs that you want," but knowing that this project only could emerge in collaboration with community, and with situating yourself as a kind of listening ear and photographing eye within the Birmingham Black community.
I think it's both in collaborating with the community and doing the research.
Hmm.
Doing the research that suggests that there's something that you don't know. Don't go to a place assuming that you know the narrative and making work about that. Because I had a conversation with someone about that, and I said, if Spike Lee had done a certain degree of research when he made Four Little Girls, that film would have been four little girls and two boys.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way had he known that two young African American boys were killed that day, that they'd have been left out of that film. I just find that hard to believe. So for me, it's about doing the research that presumes that there's something that one doesn't know and being open to what that might reveal, that might then propel the work forward. Because, the Birmingham Project was the beginning of what had become, to me, a larger and ongoing history project. The second part of which was Night Coming Tenderly Black,
Mm-hmm.
that looks at both the real and imagined path of fugitivity for African Americans escaping from slavery. And that work also began with a certain amount of research at the Historical Society in Cleveland, Ohio. Uh, I never presume to know. I have the interest, I have a sense of the history, but I always have a sense that the more I know in terms of research, the more deeply, in some almost unnameable way, that will embed itself in the work. But
Mm-hmm.
it certainly gives me the confidence and the integrity to do the work.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are things I know about Birmingham. I mean, I could just do a 2-3 hour lecture about that history,
Mm-hmm.
because that's how deeply I've studied it. That's how deeply I know it, which allows me to come in and then figure out conceptually, informally, and materially what to make of it. But by the time I get to that point, I know what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I can engage in a serious conversation about their history. It's just about giving it some kind of resonant, coherent, and dynamic form.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been my approach to this work since the Birmingham work. To
Mm-hmm.
not assume I know, but to embed the work in history, to embed the work in research, and then out of that research, begin to figure out the shape of the work, but not to just kind of parachute in, make the work, and then parachute out. You know, that's why I ended up in Birmingham for at least 8 years, and which is why I still have a very deep community
Mm-hmm.
uh, in Birmingham.
And you've returned to Birmingham and made a film that sort of is in conversation with, is or sort of the next part of the Birmingham Project.
Yeah. After I completed the photograph, I knew I wanted to visualize that moment uh, in a different way through the moving image, to find yet another way to talk about
Mm-hmm.
that history, because I had read in my research about that Sunday morning as being one, it was a bright blue Sunday morning. So I wanted to do a video work in which that beautiful bright blue sky, that if you imagine those four girls in the back of their parents' car driving to church,
Mm-hmm.
and you're small and you're looking up, you don't see everything. You see the sky, you see the tops of houses, you see the trees. So I wanted to visualize that, as well as to give a sense of some of the interior spaces, what they might have felt like uh, at uninhabited spaces.
Mm-hmm.
Quiet spaces, bright blue sky, and we know that there is a major trauma that lies ahead. And much like the two locations in which I chose to make the photograph, in the video, the four sites are a black barbershop,
Mm-hmm.
a black beauty parlor, again, black communal social spaces, as well as a lunch counter, you know, a highly contested social space, lunch counter sittings, and then a classroom, you know, to embrace that piece of history around the segregated nature of the schools and education. So I have the camera moving through these four spaces, even as the four girls are moving toward the church. And so that's what the 9/15/63 again diptych
Mm-hmm.
video work is about. Again, you know, embodying visually these kind of dualities and multiplicities that are always at play. It's never this, there's also that that's going on. And to bring them together. If anyone watching is interested and in New York, the 9/15/63 video is showing as part of my survey exhibition at the Whitney, as well as a nice selection of the Birmingham Project diptychs themselves. And they've installed them. I won't say too much other than go see it. It's a really beautiful installation of that work in the first floor space, in an almost kind of sanctuary-like space. The walls are dark. It's a space that wraps itself very beautifully and lovingly and touchingly around the history and those four young African Americans whose lives are at the center of that project.
And you know, you were saying the most recent three projects are about history, um, which, and to me they're also very much um, a, about time, about how photography and film help us understand time. And it seems that also the work is trying to kind of articulate a different kind of rhythm of time, right? And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how you're thinking about, or how Birmingham Project broadly engages or disrupts or intervenes in the different ways that we think about photography and time, or black time, or the time of justice, right? Because we're always, part of, I think, black time is thinking about, when does justice come, right? And so it seems, your work is giving us these different kinds of rhythms or engagements with time.
Well, photography certainly in a different way from the moving image, which is about an extended notion of time. But photography is always presumed uh, certain kinds of unmanipulated photographs anyway, are presumed to be about the nowness of the moment uh, in which they're made. Uh, the thing that I'm most interested in now is using the medium, which I think people still bring a degree of belief to.
Mm-hmm.
They want to believe what they're seeing,
Mm-hmm.
and they presume, unless it's conspicuously manipulated, that what they're seeing bears some reference to what was there. What I'm doing is trying to get that and make photographs in the now that actually create a very visceral experience of the past. Certainly with the night coming tenderly, black work, uh, both its materiality, the manipulation of the material, the creation of this kind of darkness, that's landscape of fugitivity, the scale, the very large scale, which allows one to physically immerse themselves, and I would say in some ways lose oneself in the photograph. I'm very much engaged right now with this idea of creating a kind of liminal experience that is the past and present simultaneously, unlike the way we think of photographs as being very much of the now. Uh, I've been for the last now 2 years, because a year disappeared through the pandemic, but and anytime I get ready to say a year, I realize, no, it's not a year. We lost that year. This is the year before. But I had been spending time in Louisiana photographing on and around the landscape of four different plantations in Louisiana. And I'm going back in a few weeks to finish up the film, the C Channel video work that I'm working on there, which is again about being in the landscape of the past in the contemporary present moment, and make something that speaks to both and provokes a conversation about that past.
Mm-hmm.
What I most want the work to do, and the reason I make it, is to provoke a conversation about the Black past in the contemporary moment, you know. And clearly it's now because I made it.
Mm-hmm.
I had an interesting experience when the work was shown at the Art Institute of Chicago, and two women were standing in front of the work, and I walked into the room, and I guess they'd seen my picture somewhere, but when they saw me, they were kind of jolted, and they said, "You made these, right?" And I said, "Yeah." They said, but you made them now, right? So there was a little confusion going on, and that thing that I hoped would happen, that he would become so embraced in the work
Mhm.
that the present would actually receive, and you would be drawn into, you know, the imagination of this space of the past that I'm
Mm.
to evoke and invoke uh, in the work. So as far as time and photography, I'm trying to do this contradictory thing with this
Mhm.
medium that is known for making photographs about what's in front of the camera right now.
Mhm. Mhm.
To make photographs of things that are there, but to make them in a way that suggests the past and the present simultaneously. And then I'm going to continue that work as soon as I finish the Louisiana work. I'm getting ready to go to Virginia and continue this work. To go back to the beginning, where we enter
Mhm.
and how the Black body entered into the American social and geographic landscape.
Mhm.
I'm going to take that on next. So I know I answered part of your question, but
Yeah.
in relation to time, you know, that's how I think about time. You know, that the medium can be meant to, in a very resonant way, suggest the past as much as the present.
I mean, I think it's so, and I think the Birmingham Project especially does this so beautifully because, we carry the past with us, right? And so, right, the past is never really past,
Yep,
right?
yep.
Um, and and I guess I'm thinking about the ways that these questions about the kind of mm, aesthetics and ethics of representing violence against Black people, right? Has it's never not been an important question in the history of Black representation, but it feels especially urgent in this moment with
Absolutely.
the hyper circulation and availability of images, of videos and photographs of the murder of Black people, right, by the police, by the state, by people who feel emboldened by the by the state,
Mm.
um, and and I think your work is offers us other ways of conceptualizing or um, of reckoning with that. And so I'm wondering, as we sort of get to the end, what do you think the conversation is that you would like to provoke in this moment, in the light of the last year, especially, is the conversation around, the number of ways that we can engage the visual to respond to the history and present of images of anti-Black violence.
Well, one way that I can respond to that, one visceral way to respond to that, was that while I was in Birmingham, making work about those 6 young African Americans who were killed there in 1963. Trayvon Martin was killed while I was there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very much apparent that that work is not uh, about or not solely about the past, because the present intruded on the very moment in which I was making that work in a very ugly way that has a long-standing history that traces back to the very moment in which Africans who became African Americans entered into the American conversation. the history, and this is something that I'm getting closer to now, working on the plantations and then going to Virginia. This has always been the history. This has always been the history. This is why this always needs to be the conversation. Even though in the post-George Floyd moment, the core of that brilliant, courageous, young Black woman, 17 years old,
Mhm.
because of her steadfastness as a witness, amplified the issue once again in a way that was undeniable. But this is it's an ongoing set of circumstances. Will Brown was 1919. Those children were killed in 1963. Trayvon Martin was killed in 2012. And obviously, it's not just those three, or those four, or those five, or those 10, you know. So the thing that I most want to, I think you could say, provoke, because I don't know that artwork itself provides answers.
Mhm.
I actually don't think it does. I think it provokes questions. It can be made to provoke necessary questions out of which can come a shift in circumstances. But I don't think the photographs answer the question so much as they can draw one into uh, those questions, especially in the context in which my work is shown.
Mhm. Mhm.
But you don't necessarily go to those places to engage with those questions.
Mhm.
Because when you encounter my work in those places, you have to contend with those questions. You have to contend with what this work is about. The circumstances of this work that are very relevant to the moment that we are standing in right now. I see that they're asking about a question. Maybe who's moderating these questions?
Oh, that would be us. I want to get to the question, but I wanted also to respond to what you were just saying about, that photographs provoke, but they provoke, but they don't answer, and about what different spaces, viewing different spaces, and I'm thinking about where we started with the movement, right, and having that um, that copy of that book, which, I think the copy I have says that it sold for like $1.25
Yep.
in 1964, right? Words, text by the Lorraine Hansberry, and photographs by, Danny Lyon and so many other luminaries of photography. But what it meant for you to be able to, like, that it did jolt you, right? It provoked that conversation. Um, but I also think that, I think the value, or the work that seeing work like yours, like the Birmingham Project or Night Coming Tenderly Black, in the space of a museum or a gallery, is also, is about, that it offers a space for reflection. And as you were saying with the film as a kind of sanctuary, that, at its best, museums and galleries can provide a kind of, welcoming, quiet place to engage with art, and to give people a kind of breathing room, right? To be able to think about, what's next, or to feel, their way through questions. And so I think that there's, um, you know so maybe Dawoud, um, a future project is your the next version of the movement. that, um, while we also have the opportunity to continue
I,
to see.
I won't get any cats out of the bag, but there is something being planned as a kind of, I wouldn't call it a conclusion, but a bringing together of these history works. But I'm not at liberty to say just what. Uh,
Okay, well, you heard it all here. Heard it here, folks.
yeah, I'm sorry you won't hear it here, say. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but I think it's important because you know my work in the context of museums and galleries help to re-inscribe, in fact, what those spaces can be. You know, because to me, museums are the places where there are ideas embedded in objects.
Mm,
Every object in a museum is about a particular idea, a certain proposition being put forth through the object. Uh, the assumption is that when we go to a museum, we're seeing those ideas embodied in a well-made object,
mhm,
something that I do have a very high regard for. But I'm a maker. I make objects about certain things, but I try to make them at a very high level, uh, which is how and why they end up in the places that they end up. But what I choose to talk about and the question that I choose to have my work embody within that larger conversation around ideas is the thing that my work is very much about.
mm. I'm gonna take the question. We probably have time for a few questions if people want to type any questions they have in using the Q&A function. This question comes from Talisha Tucker. Has there been anything that has happened during the past year, given our political climate, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the current social tipping point, that has enriched your perspective or work?
Well, I would say as a Black person in America, something's always happening to continue to inform uh, my sense of the work. So I cannot say that what has happened this past year or two has necessarily changed the shape of my work as much as giving it added urgency. I think if anything, it gives my work added urgency. You know, that the things I'm making work about do matter. And we have yet another set of reasons for why they matter. And as institutions attempt to grapple with these questions, the position and the place of my work within the institutional setting also becomes meaningful, even though for me it has been meaningful for a very long time, which is why I've chosen that as my arena. You know, that's the stage that I've chosen to enact my ideas on. So I think, if anything, in response to that question, it's given my work greater urgency.
Mm. That's great. I'm gonna add on to the question and ask, has there anything in the past year visually that has kind of sparked your imagination or has resonated for you? Um,
Visually,
yeah, I was
well,
thinking.
you, I don't want to get into naming names or specific objects, but I think if you go all the way back
Mhm,
to when I was younger and beginning on my path, one of my primary influences, even more so than visual, has been the music of John Coltrane. John Coltrane had a transformative effect on me when I was much younger. I think much the way Toni Morrison's work
Mhm.
still does. You know, work that is imperative, executed at the highest level, and executed with a great deal of craft and intentionality.
Mm.
Whether it's musical, literary, uh, it's interesting because most of the things that resonate to me and shape or inspire or challenge my imagination are very often literary or musical.
Mhm.
And, you know, you don't have to go into it too deeply, but I started my creative life as a musician,
As a drummer.
kind of like the answer to why. And I used to write and publish a lot of poetry too. So the literary and the musical piece as a language for intentionality is
Mm.
still something that I respond very deeply to.
Beautiful. Well, I don't see any more questions in the Q&A. Um, but so I will gonna say I'm gonna keep my ear to the ground for that next announcement, and I'm looking forward. I was really fortunate to actually I think the last exhibition that I saw um, before the pandemic, before shelter in place, was American Project at the Whitney, or excuse me, at SF MoMA.
Hmm.
So I'm
Hmm.
looking forward to seeing it at the Whitney.
That's where we had our last conversation too, if I recall.
I know in a room full of people, no masks. It seems so reckless about that now.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate these ongoing conversations, Lee.
Me too.
I will say also for those in New York or who are going to be in New York in the fall, the plantation work, which is called In This Here Place, which is
Mm,
from beloved Toni Morrison, In This Here Place, is going to open in September at Sean Kelly Gallery. And
excellent.
we'll also be showing in Prospect 5 in October. So I'm looking to try to finish that work up and go into post-production starting the end of this month.
Excellent. Dawoud, thank you so much. Always a pleasure and a joy.
Always a pleasure, Lee. Always a pleasure. I look forward to our next conversation.
Absolutely. Maybe
Okay.
I'll see you in New Orleans.
Okay. And anything that's going on, you know, you'll be one of the first people to know.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you all for staying, for being interested and for joining us. We appreciate it.